In 1943, a Navy cook aboard a destroyer in the North Atlantic fed 300 men on a stove that would not stay level. Most people picture sailors eating steak and ice cream under the stars. The truth is stranger. Number 14 on this list was so hated that men invented a nickname too crude to print on the menu. And number 3 kept whole crews awake through 20-hour watches when the ship went to battle stations. These 25 meals fueled the fleet from Pearl Harbor to the Gulf of Tonkin. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down. Number 25, bug juice. Every sailor who ever stood in a chow line remembers bug juice. It was the fleet's universal drink, a powdered fruit punch mixed by the gallon in enormous stainless steel dispensers on the mess deck. The color was never quite right. Sometimes it glowed an alarming red, sometimes a green that no fruit ever produced. The flavor changed from ship to ship depending on which packets the supply officer had loaded. Sailors swore the same powder was strong enough to strip the rust and scale off a deck plate, and more than one old salt claimed to have watched a cook use it to clean the brass. Whether that was true or a tall tale passed down the ladder, men drank gallons of it because the water tasted like the tanks it came from. Cold, sweet, and faintly chemical, bug juice was the taste of every meal at sea. Number 24, collision mats. Sailors called pancakes and waffles collision mats, and the name was earned. Turned out by the hundreds on flat griddles before dawn, they came off dense, chewy, and heavy enough to sink a rowboat. A good mess cook could keep a stack coming faster than the line could move, and men doused them in imitation maple syrup that was mostly corn syrup and coloring. On a rolling ship, breakfast was a contact sport. The stack slid, the syrup slid, and a hard turn to port sent the whole tray into a neighbor's lap. But a collision mat sat heavy in the stomach through a long morning watch, and that was the entire point. They were cheap flour, powdered eggs, and water, cooked in fat, and they carried a young sailor from Reveille clear through to the noon meal without a single complaint that anyone bothered to write down. Number 23, horsecock. This is the one the veterans grin about. Horsecock was the fleet nickname for the enormous rolls of bologna and luncheon meat that came aboard in casings the size of a man's forearm, sliced thick and slapped between two pieces of white bread with a smear of yellow mustard. It was the standard cold cut of the midnight watch, the working party, and every box lunch handed out when the galley was secured for battle. The meat was salty, faintly pink, and rubbery at the edges when it sat too long under the mess deck lights. Nobody pretended it was fine dining, but a horsecock sandwich could be eaten one-handed on a gun mount, stuffed in a peacoat pocket for a long night topside, or wolfed down in the 90 seconds a sailor had before relieving the watch. It fed the fleet in the hours the galley slept. Number 22, sea dust and cackleberries. Fresh eggs did not survive long at sea, so the Navy ran on the powdered kind. Mixed with water and poured onto a griddle, powdered eggs came out pale yellow, slightly green at the edges, and with a texture that no hen ever intended. Sailors called eggs cackleberries and salt sea dust, and a cook who could make reconstituted eggs taste like breakfast was worth his weight in ration points. The trick was fat and heat, plenty of both, cooked fast so the eggs never had time to turn to rubber. A little diced Spam folded in gave them body. A shake of pepper gave them something to hide behind. Millions of American boys learned to eat powdered eggs during the war years and kept eating them clear through Vietnam, because on a ship at sea, a hot breakfast was a hot breakfast, and complaining never filled anybody's tray. Number 21, red lead over punk. Stewed tomatoes were called red lead, and bread was called punk, and put them together, and you had one of the oldest cheap suppers in the fleet. A number 10 can of tomatoes, crushed by hand, simmered with salt, sugar, and a spoonful of bacon grease, then ladled thick and steaming over toasted bread. The bread went soft on the bottom and soaked up the sweet and sour juice until the whole plate turned almost like a pudding. It was a depression meal that walked straight up the gangway and into the Navy, and it stayed there because it cost almost nothing. and filled a hungry man fast. Old salts who grew up on farms recognized it instantly. It was Tuesday night at home, only now home was a gray steel box in the middle of the Pacific, and the same warm bowl said the same thing it always had. You will get through this. Eat! Number 20. Beans and Franks. Every Navy mess had a rotation, and beans and Franks came around like clockwork. Boston baked beans, sweet and thick with molasses, simmered until the sauce turned dark. Then hot dogs sliced into coins and stirred through until they plumped in the heat. Served with brown bread or a wedge of cornbread, it was a Wednesday supper that men could eat 2 plates of and still ask for more. The beans delivered protein for pennies. The Franks made it feel like a real meal instead of just a side. Ship's cooks loved it because a single steam kettle could turn out enough to feed a whole division, and it held for hours on the line without turning to mush. From the destroyers of the Atlantic to the carriers off Vietnam, beans and Franks fed generations of enlisted men, cheap, filling, and reliable in a way that mattered more than flavor ever did. Number 19. Foreign object casserole. Somewhere in every week there was a meal the men could not identify, and the fleet name for it was as blunt as sailors always are. Mystery meat, foreign object, whatever the mess deck decided to call it that day. It was the cook's answer to the problem every galley faced, the odds and ends of the week that had to be used before they turned. Leftover roast, the last of the ground beef, whatever vegetables were softening in the reefer, all bound together with a can of cream soup and baked under a crust of crushed crackers. Some nights it was genuinely good. Some nights it was a warning. But a foreign object casserole wasted nothing. And on a ship steaming 1,000 miles from the nearest supply depot, wasting nothing was not a virtue. It was survival. The men ate it, grumbled about it, and lined up for it again the next time it appeared. First pattern break. Here is what the war movies never show you. The men who fed the fleet were not background characters. A ship's cook aboard a destroyer might wake at 3 in the morning and work until midnight, feeding 300 or 400 men, 3 meals a day, from a galley the size of a small kitchen, on a deck that pitched and rolled through every storm the ocean could throw. When the ship went to general quarters and the guns opened up, the cooks kept cooking because men fighting for their lives still had to eat. They fed the crew in shifts through battle. They handed out sandwiches to gun crews who could not leave their mounts. A hot meal in the middle of the North Atlantic was not just calories. It was proof that the ship was still a home, still holding together, still a place where somebody had gotten up before dawn to make sure you did not go hungry. That was worth more than any menu. Number 18. Cannonballs. Meatballs the size of a fist, called cannonballs for obvious reasons, were a mess deck favorite that turned cheap ground beef into something a man looked forward to. Rolled with breadcrumbs, powdered egg, and onion to stretch the meat, then baked in enormous sheet trays and simmered in a thin brown gravy. They were served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles until the plate was buried. The breadcrumbs did the real work, soaking up the juice and keeping the meat tender so it never dried out under the heat lamps. A single kettle of gravy could carry a whole meal. Men who grew up eating their mother's meatballs found something in a Navy cannonball that tasted almost like home, if they closed their eyes and did not think too hard about the gray steel around them. It was the kind of meal that made a Tuesday at sea feel a little more human. Number 17. Tuna wiggle. Also called salmon wiggle when the supply ran that way, this was the fleet's answer to a cheap, fast, filling supper. Canned tuna or salmon stirred into a thick white sauce with peas, then poured hot over toast or crackers or biscuits until the whole plate went soft. The canned fish was already cooked, already cheap, and already stacked by the case in every ship's storeroom, which made wiggle the kind of meal a galley could turn out on short notice when the plan fell apart. The peas gave it color, the white sauce gave it body, and the toast underneath turned into something almost like a dumpling as it drank up the sauce. It was not a dish anyone bragged about writing home. but it fed a division fast. It used what was already aboard, and it tasted a great deal better than it had any right to. Number 16. Chili mac. Take a pot of chili, dump in a pot of macaroni, and you have chili mac, one of the most beloved and most enduring meals in Navy history. The chili was heavy on beans and tomato, light on beef, seasoned with chili powder and cumin and whatever the cook favored. The macaroni doubled the volume for almost nothing and soaked up the sauce until every noodle carried the flavor. Served in a steel tray with a square of cornbread on the side, chili mac was a cold weather meal that stuck to a man's ribs through the longest watch. Ship's cooks adored it because it was nearly impossible to ruin and stretched a small amount of meat across a huge crew. Sailors adored it because it actually tasted good, which on a mess deck was not something a man could take for granted. It survived from the war years straight through to today. Second pattern break. Here is something worth stopping on. The Navy fed men on a budget that would shock a modern American. During the war years, the ration allowance was measured in cents per man per day, and the cooks were expected to turn those pennies into 3 hot meals for hundreds of hungry sailors. That is why so many of these dishes lean on the same handful of ingredients. Beans, because they cost almost nothing and kept forever. Canned tomatoes, because they added brightness and color to bland food. Powdered eggs and powdered milk, because fresh anything spoiled in days at sea. Bread and macaroni and potatoes, because starch was cheap and filling, and a full man was a working man. There was no waste, because there could not be. Every scrap of leftover meat became tomorrow's casserole. Every ham bone flavored the next pot of soup. The men who ran those galleys were not chefs. They were engineers of scarcity, and they kept a fighting fleet fed on almost nothing. Number 15. SOS, chipped beef. We are getting close to the top now, but chipped beef earns its spot on the way. Thin slices of dried salted beef, torn into strips and stirred into a thick, peppery white gravy, then poured over toast. The military served it by the ton, and every man who wore the uniform between Pearl Harbor and Vietnam ate it. The salt in the beef seasoned the whole sauce. The gravy soaked into the toast and turned it soft and rich. It was fast, it was cheap, and it was filling, which made it the perfect breakfast for a crew that had to be fed and back to work before the sun cleared the horizon. Cooks could make it from shelf-stable ingredients that never spoiled, which meant it appeared no matter how far the ship was from port. The men had a name for it. We will get to the full version soon enough. Number 14. Baked heart and liver. Now here is the dish that earned a nickname too crude for the menu board. Organ meats were cheap, nutritious, and plentiful, and a thrifty Navy was not about to throw them away. Beef liver sliced thin, dredged in flour, and fried fast with a mountain of onions was a standard supper, packed with iron and protein that kept men strong through brutal work. The problem was cooking it right. Left in the pan too long, liver turned tough and bitter. And a galley feeding 400 men rarely had the luxury of pulling every slice at the perfect moment. So, a generation of sailors grew up convinced they hated liver, when what they really hated was overcooked liver served cold on a steel tray. The men who got it fresh from a careful cook knew better. Rich, mild, faintly sweet under the caramelized onions, it was one of the most nourishing meals the fleet ever put out. Number 13. Sliders. The Navy hamburger had a name, and the name was Slider, because a good one was greasy enough to slide right down. Cooked on a flat griddle by the hundreds, pressed thin, and slapped onto a soft bun with a slice of cheese and a limp piece of lettuce. The Slider was the fast food of the fleet long before America had drive-thrus. The mess deck grill that turned them out even picked up the nickname, the Sliders, a place a hungry sailor could get a hot burger between meals. They were not fancy. The meat was cheap, the bun was soft, and the whole thing was assembled in seconds. But after a long watch, a slider hot off the griddle with cheese melting down the sides, was as close to a taste of home as a young man got in the middle of the ocean. Men still talk about them with real affection. Number 12. Baked beans for breakfast. Landlubbers found it strange, but the Navy served beans in the morning, and the men came to expect it. Boston baked beans, sweet and dark, alongside the eggs and the collision mats, was a Navy breakfast tradition that stretched back further than anyone aboard could remember. The logic was simple. Beans were cheap, beans were filling, and a sailor who started his day on a plate of beans did not come begging for a snack 2 hours into his watch. The molasses gave them a deep, almost smoky sweetness. A little diced pork gave them richness. And on a cold, gray morning in the North Atlantic, a scoop of hot beans next to the eggs was exactly the kind of heavy, warming start a man needed before he climbed topside into the wind. It was a small tradition, but traditions were how a ship held itself together, one meal at a time. Number 11. Slumgullion. Slumgullion was the mess cook's masterpiece of making something from nothing, a thick stew of whatever the galley had on hand. Ground beef browned in a kettle, then onions, then canned tomatoes, then potatoes and macaroni and any vegetable in reach, all simmered together until the whole thing thickened into a rib-sticking supper. No two batches were ever the same, because no 2 weeks left behind the same leftovers. That was the genius of it. Slumgullion was the meal that cleaned out the storeroom, used up the odds and ends before they spoiled, and turned a small amount of meat into a full kettle that fed the crew for a couple of days. The potatoes and macaroni doubled the volume for pennies. The tomatoes tied it all together. It was a Depression-era survival dish that found a permanent home in the Navy, where waste was not an option, and a full man was the whole goal. Third pattern break. Here is what nobody tells you about eating at sea. The food was only half of it. The other half was the strange, enormous fact of feeding hundreds of men who were, all of them, a very long way from home. Some of these boys were 17 years old and had never spent a night away from their mothers before the recruiter signed them up. Now they were eating powdered eggs off a steel tray in the middle of an ocean, a war going on around them, with no idea if they would ever see their kitchen tables again. The meals mattered because of what they carried. A plate of chili mac tasted a little like the diner back home. A slice of pineapple upside-down cake looked like a birthday. Beans in the morning felt like a farmhouse. The cooks were not just filling stomachs. They were smuggling a little piece of America aboard 3 times a day, so that homesick kids 12,000 miles from anywhere could remember, for the length of one meal, exactly who they were fighting to get back to. Number 10. Spam 100 ways. No single food defines the war-era Navy like Spam. Shelf-stable, cheap, and shipped by the millions of cans, it turned up in every conceivable form. Fried in thick slabs for breakfast alongside the eggs, diced into fried rice, cubed into casseroles, ground up and mixed with mustard into a sandwich spread, baked whole with a glaze of brown sugar and pineapple until it almost passed for holiday ham. Sailors joked bitterly about it, sang songs about it, cursed the man who invented it, and then ate every bite because there was always more Spam. The salt and fat made it satisfying, the versatility made it indispensable. A cook who ran short on everything else could always fall back on Spam, and the fleet ran on it from Pearl Harbor forward. For millions of American men, the taste of fried Spam is the taste of their youth, of the war, and of the strange, gray world of a ship at sea. Number 9. Navy chow mein. Somewhere along the way, chow mein became a fleet staple, the Navy's own Americanized version of a Chinese dish, and it stuck around for decades. Strips of pork or chicken, or sometimes just the leftover roast, stir-fried with celery, onion, and bean sprouts, bound in a thick brown sauce and piled over rice or crispy noodles. It gave the men a break from the endless rotation of beans and beef. a plate that tasted like something from a restaurant back home instead of a galley at sea. Cooks liked it because it stretched a small amount of meat across a lot of vegetables and rice. Sailors liked it because it was different, and different was rare and precious on a mess deck where the menu came around like the tide. Served with a scoop of rice and a splash of soy sauce, Navy chow mein was a small taste of the wider world. Number 8. Yankee pot roast. When the supply held and the cook had time, Sunday might bring pot roast, the closest thing the fleet had to a real family dinner. A cheap, tough cut of beef, the kind that chewed like leather if you rushed it, browned hard and then braised for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until it fell apart under a fork. The long, slow heat broke down the toughest meat into something tender and rich, and the drippings became a gravy that men ladled over everything on the tray. It was the meal that said the week was ending, that there was time now, that somebody in the galley had cared enough to start this at dawn so it would be ready by supper. On a warship 1,000 miles from anywhere, a plate of pot roast on a Sunday afternoon was as close to home cooking as a sailor got, and the men knew it and loved it for exactly that. Number 7. Split pea soup with ham. No pot on the mess deck stretched further than split pea soup. Dried peas, which cost almost nothing and kept forever, simmered for hours with a leftover ham bone until they dissolved into a thick green soup that could hold a spoon upright. The ham bone gave up every trace of smoke and salt it had. The peas thickened the broth without a drop of cream, and the whole enormous kettle cost the Navy almost nothing to fill. It was the perfect ship's meal, forgiving and cheap and impossible to ruin, the kind of thing a cook could leave simmering through the busiest part of the morning and come back to find better than he left it. Served with crackers or a heel of bread, it warmed a man from the inside out on the coldest watch. From the war years through Vietnam, split pea soup fed the fleet one thick, smoky bowl at a time. Number 6. Corned beef hash. Canned corned beef and diced potatoes, fried together on a flat griddle until the bottom formed a dark, crackling crust, was a breakfast the whole fleet knew by heart. It came out of a can, which meant it never spoiled and was always available, and a good cook pressed it flat and let it sit until the edges turned crisp and brown. Topped with a fried egg or a poached one when the galley was feeling generous, it was a heavy, salty, satisfying start to a working day. The men shoveled it down and went back for more. Corned beef hash asked nothing of the cook but a hot griddle and a little patience, and it gave back a breakfast that filled a sailor clear through to noon. It was humble, it was cheap, and it appeared on mess decks from the Atlantic to the Pacific for the better part of the century. Number 5. Chicken a la king. This was the fleet's idea of fancy, the dish that showed up when the cooks wanted to serve something that felt a cut above. Diced chicken in a rich cream sauce, studded with peas and pimentos and mushrooms, ladled over toast points or biscuits or rice. The cream sauce turned cheap ingredients elegant, and the little flecks of red pimento gave it a dressed-up look that stood out on a steel tray. It let a galley stretch a small amount of chicken across a whole crew, while still putting out something that looked like effort. Men who grew up eating simple food found chicken a la king almost sophisticated, a taste of the kind of meal served in a hotel dining room they had only ever seen in the movies. On a ship far from any hotel, that little illusion of luxury was exactly the point, and the men appreciated every bite. Number 4. Pineapple upside-down cake. The fleet ran on sugar as much as it ran on beans, and no dessert was more beloved than pineapple upside-down cake. Baked in enormous sheet pans, rings of canned pineapple pressed into a bed of brown sugar and butter that caramelized into a sticky, golden glaze. The cake batter poured over the top and flipped out when it came from the oven. The canned pineapple kept forever in the storeroom, which meant this taste of the tropics could appear anywhere the ship steamed, even in the gray middle of a northern ocean. A square of it on a sailor's tray was a small celebration, a birthday when there was no birthday, a reminder that sweetness still existed in the world. Ship's bakers, who worked through the night while the rest of the crew slept, took real pride in it, and the men who ate it remembered it for the rest of their lives. Number 3, battery acid. Here is what kept whole crews awake through 20-hour watches. Navy coffee, brewed thick and black and strong enough to earn the name battery acid, was not a beverage. It was fuel, medicine, and ritual all at once. The urns on the mess deck never went cold, day or night, because a warship never really slept, and neither did the men who ran it. Sailors drank it by the gallon, standing watches that ran through the night, manning stations through general quarters, pushing through exhaustion that no amount of sleep could touch. The coffee was bitter, scalding, and often hours old, reheated until it tasted like it had been strained through a boiler. Nobody cared. A cup of battery acid was the difference between a man who could hold his eyes open on the midwatch and one who could not. It fueled the fleet through every war of the century, one bitter, black, indispensable cup at a time. Number 2, Navy bean soup. If any single dish deserves to be called the taste of the United States Navy, it is bean soup. Dried Navy beans, which took their very name from this connection, simmered for hours with a ham bone or a piece of salt pork, an onion, and little else, until the beans burst open and their starch thickened the broth into a creamy, white soup, far richer than its ingredients had any right to be. It cost the Navy almost nothing and fed the crew for days. It was cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin, which made it the perfect meal for a galley feeding hundreds around the clock. A cook could leave it simmering through the worst of the morning rush and come back to something better than he had left. The name says everything. This was not a soup the Navy happened to serve. It was the Navy's own, ladled out from Pearl Harbor to the Gulf of Tonkin, one thick white bowl at a time. Number 1, SOS. The one they never forgot. At the top of the list is the meal every veteran remembers, the one that earned a name too honest for polite company. Creamed chipped beef on toast, known throughout the fleet by 3 letters that stood for a phrase we cannot quite print, though the men said it with a strange kind of love. Dried, salted beef, torn into strips and folded into a thick, peppery white gravy, then poured hot over toast until the bread went soft beneath it. It was the breakfast that fed the American military through every war of the 20th century. Cheap, fast, and made from ingredients that never spoiled no matter how far the ship was from home. Men cursed it and craved it in the same breath. They complained about it for 50 years and then made it in their own kitchens for their grandchildren. Because somewhere along the way, the taste stopped being just food. It became the taste of being young and scared and alive and part of something bigger than themselves. That is why they never forgot it. That is why they still make it. And now you know exactly what they were remembering. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The SOS, the Navy bean soup, the Chili Mac. Then come back and tell me if the men who ate it were right. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments, and if you had someone in the family who served, ask them what they remember from the mess deck. You might be surprised what still gets a smile all these years later.